The wind has teeth tonight. It claws at the sod roof of Silas's dugout, moaning through the cracks in the doorframe like a sinner at the gallows. He sits at his rough-hewn table, a single lantern pushing a weak circle of gold into the oppressive dark. Outside, the Wyoming Territory is a vast, black ocean of rock and sagebrush. He's listening, not to the wind, but to what rides upon it. There it is again, a thin, reedy cry, almost lost in the gale, coming from the direction of the old Black Creek mine. It's the sound the townsfolk in Redemption whisper about over watered-down whiskey and stale bread. They call it the wail of Mad Jenny, the prospector's wife who supposedly lost her mind and her baby in a cave-in 30 years ago. They say her spirit still searches, still weeps in the hollows of the earth. Silas has heard it before, dismissed it as a trick of the wind whistling through the jagged outcrops. But tonight, it sounds different. Less like a ghostly echo, more like a voice. A woman's voice, stretched thin by desperation. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The sound is raw, human, a plea snagged on the thorns of the wind. Silas grips the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The people of Redemption are good at telling stories to keep themselves warm, tales to explain away the unsettling noises of a wild land. But Silas has known real grief, heard its true voice, and the cry from the mine sounds terrifyingly like it. He stands, the legs of his chair scraping against the packed earth floor. The lantern light catches the haunted look in his eyes. Ghost or woman, something out there is suffering, and he is the only one close enough to hear it. The dugout had been his life for 5 years, ever since Martha and little Samuel were taken by the fever. He'd sold their small homestead back east and walked away from the ghosts in that house, only to find the West had ghosts of its own. He bought this worthless tract of land for a song because it bordered the abandoned Black Creek claim. The land was too rocky to farm properly and too dry to graze more than a handful of scrawny cattle, but its isolation had suited the hollowed-out shape of his life. He worked from can't see to can't see, the physical exhaustion a welcome balm for the ache in his soul. He rarely went to the town of Redemption, a dusty collection of false front buildings 5 miles south, and when he did, he spoke little. The townsfolk saw a gaunt, quiet man with eyes that held the permanent shadow of loss. They left him to his solitude. The first time he'd heard the sound from the mine, it had been a month prior, on a still, clear evening. A faint, mournful note that rose and fell with the breeze. He'd thought it was a coyote pup, separated from its mother. But the sound persisted, intermittent, always seeming to come from the jagged maw of the old mine entrance that gaped from the hillside a half-mile away. When he'd bought supplies the following week, he'd mentioned it to Mr. Abernathy at the general store. The portly shopkeeper had stopped weighing out flour, his eyes wide with a mixture of pity and fear. "That's no animal, son," he'd said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's Jenny. Mad Jenny." Her husband was chasing a silver vein, and the whole north tunnel collapsed on him. She dug with her bare hands for 3 days, calling his name. They say she was with child. When they finally pulled her away, her mind was gone. Died a week later. Her spirit's still in there, wailing for her lost family. Silas had just nodded, paid for his supplies, and left. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in wind and rock and the tricks of a lonely mind. He believed that the dead were silent. It was the living who made all the noise. He'd spent the next few weeks forcing himself to ignore the cries, attributing them to the strange acoustics of the hills. But the sound was changing. It was growing less ethereal, more urgent. It was beginning to fray his carefully constructed peace. A week later, a sudden, violent thunderstorm had descended from the Bighorn Mountains, turning his parched land to a slick, running mud. The rain hammered on his roof, a deafening drum against the silence of his life. And through it, clearer than ever before, he heard the cry. It wasn't a mournful wail now. It was a sharp, piercing shriek of pure terror, followed by a low, desperate sobbing. The sound cut through the roar of the storm and straight into the hole in his chest where his own family used to be. A ghost wouldn't be afraid of a storm. A ghost wouldn't sob with such heartbreaking despair. He stood by the door, his hand on the latch, Every protective instinct he thought had died, with his wife roaring back to life. He remembered Martha's cries when Samuel's fever had peaked, the sound of a mother's soul being torn apart. This was that sound. Living, breathing, suffering. The town's folklore felt like a flimsy excuse, a comfortable blanket thrown over a terrifying reality. What if it wasn't a ghost? What if, by some impossible circumstance, a woman was trapped in that mine? The thought was so horrific it made him feel cold despite the humidity of the storm. To be alone in the dark, buried alive, with only a ghost story for company. He couldn't let it be. He couldn't be the man who heard those cries and chose to believe in ghosts because it was easier. He had done nothing to save Martha and Samuel. The fever had been an enemy he couldn't fight. But this he could do something about. The decision settled in him, heavy and solid as granite. He would go. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of wet sage and ozone. Silas didn't bother with breakfast. He moved with a grim purpose he hadn't felt in years. He checked the oil in his 2 best lanterns, packed a coil of sturdy rope, a pickaxe, a waterskin, and a canvas sack with jerky and hardtack. He strapped a hunting knife to his belt and slung his rifle over his shoulder, more for the threat of mountain cats than any spectral beings. As he worked, the image of Martha's face, pale and frightened in her final hours, kept flashing in his mind. He was fueling his resolve with the embers of his own old pain. He made his way toward the mine, his boots sinking into the soft, red mud. The entrance was a dark wound in the hillside, framed by a rickety, rotting timber structure. A faded sign, nailed to one of the supports, read Black Creek Mining Company, keep out. The air grew cooler as he approached, carrying a damp, mineral scent of deep earth. A sense of profound wrongness hung over the place. He could understand why the townsfolk avoided it. It felt like a place where hope went to die. He stood at the threshold, peering into the impenetrable blackness. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding small and inadequate against the vast silence. "Is anyone in there?" Only the drip, drip, drip of water seeping through rock answered him. For a moment, doubt crept in. He felt foolish, a grown man chasing a sound on the wind, spurred by grief. Maybe Abernathy was right. Maybe it was just a story, and he was just a lonely man hearing what his heart wanted to hear, a chance to save someone. He was about to turn away when he heard it. Not a wail, but a soft, unmistakable sound from deep within the mine. A cough. A weak, human cough. It was all the confirmation he needed. He lit one of the lanterns, the flames sputtering to life and casting long, dancing shadows. He took a deep breath, the cold, stale air filling his lungs, and stepped out of the daylight and into the belly of the earth. The main tunnel was wide enough for an or cart, but the tracks were long gone, swallowed by mud and rockfalls. The beam of his lantern cut a small, shifting tunnel through the absolute darkness. The silence was immense, broken only by the scuff of his boots and the steady dripping of water. He walked slowly, carefully, testing the ground before each step, his eyes scanning the timber supports, many of which were splintered and bowing under the immense weight of the mountain. He called out again, "Hello? I'm here to help." This time, a faint sound answered him. A voice, hoarse and thin. "Here." The word was barely a whisper, but it galvanized him. He moved faster now, his heart hammering against his ribs. He followed the sound deeper into the mine, past branching tunnels and collapsed passages. The air grew thicker, heavier. He had to navigate a narrow section where the roof had partially caved in, squeezing through a gap barely wide enough for his shoulders. On the other side, the tunnel opened up again, and he saw it. A recent rockfall blocked the path ahead. A mountain of dark, wet rock and splintered timbers was piled nearly to the ceiling, and from behind it came a soft, whimpering sound. "Can you hear me?" A pause, then the voice, stronger this time, laced with disbelief and fragile hope. "Yes, oh, thank God. I can hear you. Are you hurt?" "My leg. I think it's broken." "And I'm with child," she said, her voice catching on a sob. Silas closed his eyes for a second, a wave of cold dread and fierce determination washing over him. A pregnant woman. He had been right. The thought of what she must have endured, alone in this suffocating darkness, was almost too much to bear. "All right," he said, forcing his voice to be calm and steady. You just hold on. I'm going to get you out. What's your name? Alara, she whispered. Silas. I'm Silas. Alara, I need you to move as far back from the rocks as you can. I'm going to have to move some of this, and it might not be stable. He set down the lantern, the light creating a stark, dramatic scene of shadow and stone. He took up his pickaxe and began to work. The task was Herculean. The rocks were heavy, slick with mud, and wedged together in a precarious jumble. Every stone he moved threatened to bring more down. He worked with a controlled, desperate energy, his muscles screaming in protest. He ignored the pain, ignored the sweat stinging his eyes, ignored the fear of being buried alive alongside her. He focused only on the next rock and the next. For hours, the only sounds were his own ragged breaths, the scrape and clatter of stone, and Alara's occasional, quiet words of encouragement from the other side. He created a small opening near the bottom. Alara, can you see the light? Yes. Her voice was thick with tears. I can see it. That single word spurred him on. He worked faster, his hands raw and bleeding, his body trembling with exhaustion. He finally cleared an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. He shone his lantern into the dark space beyond. She was huddled against the far wall, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her dress torn. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, crudely splinted with a piece of rotted timber and strips of her petticoat. But her eyes, wide and luminous in the lantern light, were fixed on him with an expression of profound, soul-deep gratitude. He saw her hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly. She had been fighting not just for her own life, but for the one she carried within her. It's all right, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I've got you. He crawled through the opening, the close, musty air of her prison filling his lungs. He carefully examined her leg. It was a bad break. She wouldn't be able to walk. Getting her out was going to be even harder than getting to her. We're going to do this slow, he said, looking her directly in the eyes, trying to pour all his strength and reassurance into his gaze. I'm going to carry you. It will hurt, but I will be as careful as I can. She just nodded, her jaw tight with pain, but her eyes trusting. The journey out was a slow, agonizing nightmare. He fashioned a makeshift sling from his rope to help support her, but carrying her through the narrow, treacherous passages tested the very limits of his strength. He had to half-crawl through the tightest sections, dragging her carefully behind him. Every jostle sent a spasm of pain through her, and he could feel her tremors against his back, could hear her stifled gasps. But she never once cried out. Her resilience was astonishing. He gritted his teeth, focused on the small circle of light from the lantern he'd hung from his belt, and just kept moving. He talked to her, a low murmur of encouragement, telling her about his land, the sky, the clean air waiting for them, anything to keep her mind off the pain and the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A pale, gray luminescence ahead. The mine entrance. Hope, real and dazzling, surged through him, giving him a final burst of adrenaline. He stumbled the last few yards, emerging from the darkness and into the soft light of late afternoon. He blinked, his eyes watering, and gently lowered Alara to the ground, propping her against the rock wall. She closed her eyes, turning her face to the sky, and took a deep, shuddering breath of fresh air. Tears streamed from under her closed lids, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Silas collapsed beside her, his body utterly spent, his lungs heaving. For a long moment, they just sat there, two strangers bound by a shared ordeal, listening to the sound of the wind, a sound that was no longer a ghostly wail, but a simple, cleansing breeze. He eventually managed to get her onto his back again for the final trek to his dugout. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire dwelling. He cleaned her cuts, gave her sips of water, and did his best to make the splint on her leg more secure. She watched him with those wide, exhausted eyes, a silent gratitude radiating from her that was more powerful than any words. As twilight settled, painting the landscape in shades of purple and orange, she finally spoke, her voice still a raw whisper. How did you know? Silas was tending the small fire he'd built in the hearth. He looked over at her, the firelight flickering across his weary face. I heard you, he said simply. The folks in town, they thought you were a ghost. A faint, Sad smile touched her lips. I suppose I almost was. I was traveling to meet my husband's family in Oregon. He passed from cholera on the trail. I was alone. A flash flood came through the canyon. My wagon was destroyed. I saw the mine and ran for shelter. The rocks fell. I don't know when. A few days ago, I think. I thought I would die in there. Her hand went to her stomach. I couldn't give up. Not with the baby. Silas nodded, understanding perfectly. He saw in her the same stubborn refusal to be broken that had kept him putting one foot in front of the other for 5 years. He had been surviving. She had been fighting for a future. He brought her a bowl of thin broth, all he had that was easy to swallow. She ate slowly, gratefully. The small, quiet space of the dugout was filled with a sense of peace it hadn't known in years. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was comfortable, a shared space of recovery. He had pulled her from the darkness of the earth, and in doing so, she had pulled him from the darkness of his own solitude. He sat in his chair, watching as she finally drifted into a deep, healing sleep. The wind picked up outside, whistling around the corners of the dugout. But tonight, it was just wind. The ghosts were gone. He looked at this woman, this stranger who had endured the unthinkable, her body nurturing a new life even as her own was in peril. He had gone to the mine to quiet a sound that disturbed his peace, but he had found something else entirely. He had found a reason. The gaping hole in his life didn't feel so vast anymore. In the heart of his desolate land, in the quiet of his humble home, life had returned. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They survived hardship and found a new beginning. What are you hoping for them next? Share in the comments.